Welcome back, our dear travelers. This is Timescape, the show where we travel back in time to learn about history. Today's episode is a Chinese New Year special.
We Filipinos and Chinoy families celebrate New Year every year in the hope of attracting prosperity, closer family ties, and peace.
We clean our homes thoroughly, display fruits on the table, serve sweet foods like tikoy, and prepare lucky money in Nampao.
But how well do we know the history behind Chinese New Year, or how did it come to be?
Let's go on a journey back in the dynasty of China and find out. And now, we will be discussing the introduction of the Chinese dynasty. Writings in China dates back to the hieroglyphs that were used in the Shang dynasty of 17,000 to 150 BC. Chinese literature is a vast subject that spans thousands of years. One of the interesting things about Chinese literature is that much of the serious literature was composed using a formal writing or written in the language that is called Classical Chinese. However, even during the Qing dynasty of 100 or 200 years ago, most writers composed in a literary stream that extended back about 2,400 years. They studied very ancient writings and more or less the original written language. And also, Chinese literary works includes fiction, philosophical and religious works, poetry, and scientific writings. The dynastic eras frame the history of Chinese literature and are examined one by one. The written language was used by people of many different ethnic groups and countries during the Shu and Qin and Han eras. However, the written language wasn't the vernacular language even 2,000 years ago. Those empires are groups of kingdoms of all these eras were composed of people speaking many different native language. Let's move forward with Shang dynasty. The first dynasty for which there is historical records and archaeological evidence in the Shang dynasty. It was a small empire. In northern central China, no documents from the country survive, but there are archaeological finds or findings of hieroglyphic writing on bronze wares and oracle bones, and it is considered they evolved into ideographic and partly phonetic Chinese character. Let's move forward with the Shu dynasty. The Shu dynasty was contemporaneous with the Shang dynasty, and then they conquered the Shang dynasty because their dynasty lasted for about 800 years. But once and foremost, of all times, their original territory was broken up into dozens of competing kingdoms, and this finally collapses or collide into several big and varying kingdoms by the end of the Shu era. Moving forward with the third one, which is the Qin dynasty. At the end of the Shu dynasty era, that is called the Warring States period, of the surviving few big states in the land of Qin dynasty became the most powerful. And also, it had big armies and conquered the others. Once the Qin emperors had control, he wanted to keep it and squelched any conquered territories there were in the Qin dynasty. And the next one is going to be the Han dynasty. A former peasant leader overthrew the Qin Empire, and also the Han dynasty era lasted for about 400 years, and also it is the beginning of the era for Confucianism was revived. because Confucian texts were written, rewritten, and republished during this era. Confucianism was mixed with the legalism philosophy of Li Si. And the last one is going to be the Tang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty had a big empire that benefited from trade with the West along the Silk Road, and also battled with the Tibetan Empire and experienced the growing influence of organized Buddhist religion. This is the Chinese dynasty.
Hi, this is Dayan Kashmir S. Butlig, and now let's talk about the Shang Dynasty. The Shang Dynasty is China's oldest sovereign dynasty. From 1600 to 1046 BC, the Shang was governed. The earliest written record in Chinese history came from the Shang Dynasty, which began when a tribal ruler named Tang destroyed the Xia dynasty around 1600 BC according to the methodology. Ji, a dictator, ruled over the country. The Shang is the second of the three dynasties period dynasty. Instead of lost wax casting, the Shang dynasty used piece of mold casting. This means they had to make a model of a product they wanted to make before using a clay mold to make it. After then, the clay mold would be broken into portions, removed and repaired to make a unified one. The Shang dynasty's language is an early form of ancient Chinese. Shang ruled over China's Yellow River Valley during a majority of the second millennium BCE, roughly 1766 to 1046 BCE. It could have been the one of the written record, but it doesn't indicate there was only one. Scholars are now attempting the assertions how much this culture affected one, rather at more recently found archaeological sites far afield from the Yellow River Valley, which revealed entirely different societies from the Shang. Now let's talk about the Shang city, Shang power hierarchy, and the Shang tribes. Now let's talk about first the Shang city. The Shang builds massive city with the instinct social classes, improved earlier irrigation system, mastered the use of bronze, and invented a writing system. There were some significant communities during the Shang dynasty, notable and Anyang. However, they are not considered to have been as densely populated as a Mesopotamian settlement at that time. The second bullet, built an environment in the northern China. Shang towns were not well preserved in the archipelago's record. Cities played an important role in political and religious matters since they are housed administrative offices, royal tombs, palaces, and shrines. Outside of these cities, the common people were concentrated in agricultural areas. Now, the power and the social hierarchy. The authority of the Shang dynasty was focused in the number of ancient towns, some of which have been discovered by the archaeologists. The first Shang monarch is said to have established a new capital for this dynasty near modern days, a 2.6 million people cities in eastern China, Henan province. Next is the Shang caves. Superior were buried in the room with their rulers during royal burials. Anyang has a cave going back to the circa 1200 BC. 74 human bodies as well as horses and dogs were housed alongside the undefined ruler cadaver. There are also 60 bronze wine vessels with an animal representations in the burial. Now let's move on to the writing and culture of Shang. The writing on oracle bones indicate implying that this language has been around for a long time. In reality, because the language is also similar to the present Chinese writing, modern scholars can read it. Because observation could be recorded more precisely with writing, science advancement throughout the Shang dynasty. The oracle scripts are written reports of the eclipse and other celestial events by the Shang period scientists. The Shang created a musical instrument too. Wind instruments like an ocarina, drum, and the cymbals were popular during the Shang period. Other instruments such as bells and bone flutes have been discovered. Shang constructed a lunar calendar based on the lunar cycles that were used to forecast and record key events including the crop, planting, and harvesting. Because the lunar years are shorter than solar years, which are based on the Earth's orbit around the Sun. Shang monarchs used especially qualified astronomers to make changes and ensure the calendar's correctness. And lastly is the Shang religion. Shang religion was extremely influential, extending into political and economic realm. State power was strengthened by a sense of reverence for royal Shang ancestor, which was closely linked to the Shang religion. The Shang cultures, the king was also a priest. The Shang ruler led in the worship of Shangdi, the supreme ancestor, as well as the conversing with the other ancestor, because it was believed that ancestor communicated through the deity. Animism, the notion that everything has a soul. Shamanism, the beliefs in shamans who can contact with the spiritual realm. Ancestor worships and divinations were all hallmark on the Shang religion. The moon, the sun, the wind, the rain, the dragon, and the phoenix were all portrayed by God as a natural methodological emblems. The gods of the peasants were worshipped for the abundant harvest. It was also common to the hold of festivals to honor gods. Did you know that the Chinese New Year has been celebrated for almost 3,500 years? Some says that Chinese New Year began during the Shang Dynasty, 1600 to 1046 BC, when people held a sacrificial ceremonies in honor of God and ancestors at the start and at the end of the year.
Ni hao, Ojiao, Bridalin Minorca, and welcome to the Zhou Dynasty. But before we proceed to our discussion, allow me to give you some trivia about the development of Chinese New Year that happened in this dynasty. Okay, so did you know that the calendar year was established during this Zhou Dynasty? Yes, that's correct. And also, the worship in pagan or the ancestor was become socially practiced during this time. Sounds interesting, right? Okay, so now let's proceed to the discussion of the Zhou Dynasty. The Zhou Dynasty was divided into two periods, which are the Eastern and the Western period. Both periods are remarkable when it comes to agriculture, education, and artistic. But the most important, this Zhou Dynasty was known as the Golden Age. Was known for the Golden Age when it comes for the Chinese philosophy, because during this period or during this dynasty was the birth of Confucianism, which is Confucius, and then Taoism, Tao Chi, and then the legalism, Han Peizi, which still has an impact or still used in contemporary Chinese society nowadays. The culture of Zhou Dynasty was more focused on the etiquette which they applied during the ceremonies like the wedding ceremonies or the funeral ceremonies, where the Zhou leaders not allowed or prohibited for the Zhou Dynasty or the people under the Zhou Dynasty to not get drunk during those special occasions. So, the literature during this period or during this dynasty was more on the Golden Age, because it was the birth of Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism that has still an impact nowadays Chinese society. And then it was the development of lots of books, poems, prose, literary texts during these periods, because it was the Golden Age for the Chinese philosophy. How does the Zhou Dynasty was ended? The Zhou Dynasty was ended during the warring states or the states of war, wherein the states of Qin conquered the Qingzhou, a place and where the Zhou Dynasty was ruled, and of course the last ruler of Zhou, which is the King Nan, was killed. So that's how the This is how the states or the dynasty of Zhou was ended. Around 1045 BCE, the Zhou, the group of people in northwestern China, get rid of the Chang dynasty and they created a new dynasty which is the Zhou dynasty. And they ruled the China for about 800 years. Imagine that. So it was the longest ruling dynasty in the history of China. The Zhou dynasty was the first one who introduced the concept of mandate of heaven, where their leaders believed that the God had given them the right to rule the China. So, enable them to rule the China, the Zhou leaders need to be kind, need to be fair to their people. And of course, they need to govern the China perfectly. Enable them to maintain their power in kingdom, the Zhou dynasty followed the feudal system, which have 4 stages. The highest one, or the first one, was the king, or the emperor. The second one is the lords. The third one is the knight, or the soldier, who needs to protect the country. And the fourth one, who needs to work for them, is the peasants, or the slaves. This kind of system, which is the feudal system, helps the Zhou dynasty to maintain their power in kingdom, but however, it hinders the unity of the Zhou dynasty because many lords have become powerful and independent during the time, and that independence hindered the unity of the Zhou dynasty.
Ni hao, washi Camille, and welcome to Han Dynasty, the second great imperial dynasty of China, which lasted from 206 BCE to 220 BCE. Han Dynasty thoroughly established what was considered Chinese culture, that Han became the Chinese word denoting someone who is ethnically Chinese. Han Dynasty started because the Chinese were unhappy with the strict rule of the Qin Dynasty. Liu Bang, a peasant and a man of humble birth, led the revolt against the repressive policies of the preceding short-lived dynasty. Unlike Qin, the Han Dynasty adopted a Confucian ideology that emphasized on moderation, virtue, and filial piety, and thereby masked the authoritarian policies of the regime. Another improvement in the government was they had the civil service test, where they forced people who wanted to work in the government to pass a test to prove that they are worthy of working there. This ensured that only qualified people can run the government. Han Dynasty is considered as the first golden age of China, because this is when new inventions, discoveries, and advancements were made in order to help improve the lives of the Chinese. During the Han Dynasty, the Chinese excelled in warfare and expanded their empire. All healthy men served 2 years in the army, and they were one of the first civilizations to make swords from iron. They made the world's first crossbow, and they invented the kite and used it for military purposes, such as measuring distance, sending message, or scaring enemies. How did they scare enemies using a kite? Well, soldiers would add bamboo pipes to the kites so that enemies would hear noises above them and think it was a ghost. It was also during the Han Dynasty when chain pumps, wheelbarrows, and iron plows were invented in order to improve the agricultural sector of the Chinese. For industry, silk was discovered, and this is a fabric that is extremely valuable trade commodity and #1 trade export of China. They also invented a foot-powered machine that wound silk fibers onto a large reel, which made the production of silk faster and better. The Chinese also learned how to mine salt from underground. They invented iron-tipped bamboo drills that reached as deep as 1,000 feet. They used the bamboo to bring the salt water up, boil off the water, and use the salt to preserve their food. The Han Dynasty was a very fruitful era for arts and literature. Calligraphy, a fancy form of writing, was invented. Paper, which became a cheaper alternative in creation of books and other artistic writings, was also invented. The Yufu, or Music Bureau, compiled detailed descriptions of the music of the day and its instruments, techniques, and songs. By the way, in the court and the Confucian temples, music fell into 2 categories. The first one is music to accompany banquets. The second one is ritual music. Several forms of block string instruments were used during the Han. One of them is the pipa. Paintings on standing room divider screens and on scrolls of silk appeared in the Han Dynasty as well. The first major stone tomb sculpture in China was created also during the Han Dynasty, and lifelike clay figurines of people and animals also appeared during the Han Dynasty. Han potters included house models and human figures among their funerary wares. Lacquer work was brought to extreme perfection, and most importantly, poetry was nurtured during the Han period, and a new genre called Fu, which is a combination of rhyme and prose, began to flourish. Fu were long descriptive compositions that were meant to entertain, and they became the norm of creative writing. The largest collections of historical Fu are the Wen Chuan, the Book of Han, New Songs from the Jade Terrace, and Official Dynastic Histories. In terms of prose literature, the era included works of history, philosophy, and politics. In fact, one of the greatest of early histories comes from that period in the Shiji by Sima Qian. There were various innovations and discoveries in the field of medicine as well during the Han Dynasty. Chinese doctors believed that when yin and yang were out of balance, illness would occur. People needed to have these forces in balance to be healthy. That's why acupuncture and moxibustion were techniques invented to bring these forces of yin and yang into balance. During the Han Dynasty, the Chinese used wine as an anesthetic to take away pain, and they also discovered that blood circulated from the heart to other parts of the body. Last but not the least, the field of science. Han Chinese astronomers kept records of comets in the night sky. They learned that solar eclipses happened when the moon blocks the sun. They also discovered that the moon shines by reflecting the sun's light. Two important scientific instruments were invented during this dynasty, and they are the magnetic compass with a lodestone, which helps tell direction, and the seismograph, which detects the direction of earthquakes. Finally, the Chinese believed in the concept called Feng Shui. This meant that knowing the geographic positions for their temples, graves, and homes would bring them good luck. The governmental, cultural, and technological achievements of the Han were so impressive that every ensuing dynasty sought to emulate them. Now, what role did the Han Dynasty play in terms of Chinese New Year? Well, the date of the festival, the first day of the first month of the Chinese lunar calendar, was fixed during the Han Dynasty. Certain celebration activities became popular, such as burning bamboo to make a loud cracking sound.
Ni hao. Now, we are about to unfold the history of Tang Dynasty. And as we explore, let us also discover how Tang Dynasty celebrate Chinese New Year. So, the rise of the Tang Dynasty in China mirrored the rise of the Han over 800 years earlier. Like the Han Dynasty before them, the Tang Dynasty was created after the fall of a ruthless leadership, and like the Han before them, the Tang Dynasty had their own powerful leader, Emperor Taichu. The first emperor of the Tang Dynasty, Cao continued many of the practices begun during the Sui Dynasty. He granted equal amounts of land to each adult male in return for taxes and continued the trend of local government rule. Cao also created a monetary system of copper coins and silk ribbons. He wrote a set of laws revised every 2 decades that lasted into the Ming Dynasty of the 14th century. One of Cao Chu's sons, General Li Shimin, succeeded in eliminating all political rivals of the Tang and established firm control of the Tang Dynasty over the newly reunified China. He then proceeded to murder his brothers and force his father to abdicate the throne to him, preferring his temple name. Taichung took the throne in 626 CE. The Golden Age of China had begun. The Tang Dynasty ruled one of the most powerful countries in the world. Its capital, Chang'an, now Xi'an, was then the largest city in the world. The second emperor of Tang, Li Shimin, was one of the greatest emperors in Chinese history. His openness and valor laid the foundation for the prosperity of the dynasty for 100 years. The Tang capital of Chang'an became a great international metropolis, with traders and embassies from Central Asia, Arabia, Persia, Korea, and Japan passing through. During the period, Korea, Japan, and other basal countries sent many students to study in Chang'an and Luoyang. The economy flourished in the 8th to 9th centuries with a network of rural market towns growing up to join the metropolitan markets of Chang'an and Luoyang. The Tang Dynasty produced the only female emperor in Chinese history, which is Wu Zetian. Wu Zhao, also known as Empress Wu Zetian, was the first and only woman emperor of China. With her exceptional intelligence, extraordinary competence in politics, and inordinate ambition, she ruled as the holy and divine emperor of the Second Chu Dynasty for 15 years. Emperor Taizong, the second Tang emperor, and his son Li Ming were both attracted to Wu Zhao's beauty, intelligence, and spirit. The Tang Dynasty was also the golden age for poetry, painting, tricolored lace pottery, and woodblock printing. Great Tang poets included Li Bai and Du Fu. In literature, the greatest glory of the Tang period was its poetry. By the 8th century, poets had broken away from the artificial diction and matter of the curt poetry of the Southern dynasty and achieved a new directness and naturalism. Nearly 50,000 works and by 2,000 poets survived. Foreign music and dance became popular and ancient orchestra were revived. Tang Dynasty or Tiang Dynasty, Chinese dynasty that succeeded the short-lived Sui and became a golden age for poetry, sculpture, and Buddhism. China's paper making, textile, and other technologies spread to West Asia and Europe through the Arab region. Islam was also introduced to China. As a landscape painter, the poet Wang Wei was a forerunner of the Wenren or literary man's school of mystical nature painting of latter times. The minor arts of a Tang, including ceramics, metalwork, and textile, give expression to the color and vitality of the life of that period. Printing appeared for the first time during Tang, apparently invented to help disseminate Buddhist scriptures. It was used by the end of the dynasty for such things as calendars, almanacs, and dictionary. An historic Christian community also existed there. While mosques were established in Guangzhou, Buddhism enjoyed great favor and there were new translations of Buddhist scriptures and growth of indigenous sector, including Chan. So, we already know the history of Tang Dynasty. We will back now in discovering the celebration of Chinese New Year of Tang Dynasty. The prosperity of economies and cultures during the Tang, Song, and Qing dynasties accelerated the development of the Spring Festival, which is the Chinese New Year. The costumes during the festival became similar to those of modern times. The function of the Spring Festival changed from a religious one to entertaining and social ones, more like that of today. More entertaining activities arose such as watching dragon and lion dances during the temple fair and enjoying lantern shows. Setting of firecrackers, visiting relatives and friends, and eating dumplings became important parts of the celebration of the Chinese New Year here in Tang Dynasty.
Welcome back to the 21st century.
Did you learn a lot? That's good to know.
So now, the next time you take a bite of that tikoy, you'll have a better idea of what you are celebrating for.
Now, if you'll excuse us, we're a bit jet lagged from all that time traveling.
See you in the next episode of Timescape. Sargent!